All right, let's talk about urbanization in U.S. history, the age of the city. Got some maps and charts here. Let's start top left, immigration and settlement from 1820 through 1860. So this is the percentage of population of immigrants in the total population as of 1860. Okay, the yellow means in that state 20% or more were immigrants. Green 10 to 20, orange less than 10, and then of course no information on the territories. We are going to see that number grow. Just underneath that you see the sources of that immigration, largely Irish and German, some British, some from the Americas, which would be South America, right? Some Scandinavian, very small, and then a little bit of a larger percentage of other. Immigration to the United States by decade, you can see it's definitely growing as we get to the 1850s and 60s. But then look down, bottom right, new immigration, 1861 through 1920. Where are we shifting to? We have northwestern Europe, mostly Ireland, Germany, and England, moving into Central and Eastern Europe, mostly Polish, Russian, and Hungary. Southern Europe is blue, mostly Italian and Greek. Orange is Asian, mostly Chinese, and then you have the purple there everywhere else. So you can tell we moved from 1860 to 1880, it being one type of immigrant. By the time we get into the early 1900s, we're looking at another type of immigrant. So this is what we're talking about. You'll see your textbook talk about old immigration versus new immigration. That's what they mean. So there's lots of movement in the United States during the 19th century. A lot of people are leaving rural areas in search of job opportunities in industrial cities. This is going to include African Americans. Many others are moving west. We talked about that in the Western settlement conversation, in search of land and opportunity. And you're going to see when we talk about immigration, a lot of emphasis put on what are called push and pull factors. A push factor is something that pushes you away, a reason for immigration. And a pull factor is something that pulls you toward, right? So why the United States? So it's one thing to be pushed away from your home, but what's pulling you to the US? And cities are really growing in large part because of an influx, not just of migrants from the United States, but also of immigrants. There are 25 million immigrants in the late 1800s. And these are what we would call new immigrants that come from different regions than the old immigrants came from, as we looked at in that chart on the last slide. They often tend to be paid lower, which would often sometimes create tensions between who's getting jobs. Push factors for immigration can be anything from poverty, religious persecution, political oppression. Pull factors would be freedoms, better economic opportunities. This is Angel Island. Angel Island is in California, off the coast of California. This would be where Asian immigrants would be brought near, as it says, near San Francisco to deal with Asian immigration. After 1882, all Chinese immigrants would be turned away because of the Chinese Exclusion Act, unless they could prove that they had U.S. citizenship or family in the United States. This is Ellis Island. This is the big port of call for European immigrants. The government would use pressing stations like Ellis and Angel, not Angle Island, to determine if immigrants were healthy or desirable, and all steerage passengers are going to be automatically processed through Ellis Island. By 1890, most of the population in major cities is going to actually be made up of immigrants. Oftentimes, these immigrant groups would live into neighborhoods, which were sometimes referred to as ghettos. Today, ghetto has a different kind of connotation, but technically a ghetto is just a place where people of a like background or nationality would gather together, people with similarities. So Little Italy or Chinatowns would be references to immigrant ghettos. Because of the increase in immigration, we also see an increase in nativism. Nativists believe that only Native Americans should have access to jobs, citizenship, etc. And no, I don't mean Native American Indians. I mean people born in the United States called themselves natives, nativists. We talked about the 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act, which provided banned groups. The list of banned groups for in terms of immigrations would do nothing but continue to grow. By 1894, excuse me, I need to slow down. We actually see the emergence of something called the Immigration Protection League, which would propose screening immigrants through literacy and medical tests. Could you read? Were you intelligent? What kind of job skills were you going to bring to the United States? And were you healthy? These kinds of things would determine whether or not you got in. Okay, so to the right is a little stock kind of clip arty image of a melting pot. This idea that all Americans should meld, all immigrants should join into this big pot and become American, not Chinese, not Irish, not Italian, not Mexican, not Russian, but American. Today we have a different view. Sociologists talk about a salad, right, where you come together to form something new, but you maintain your integrity as an individual ingredient. In a melting pot, you would lose that identity, and there's a lot of discussion about what assimilation should mean for immigrant groups. Salad bowl, there we go.
New immigrant groups arriving in the late 19th century became a new target for native-born Americans who did not welcome foreigners. For reasons ranging from religious intolerance to a fear of losing their own jobs, some Americans harbored strong hatred toward the newcomers, and they revived a trend called nativism.
Nativism is a constant phenomenon in American history. It goes back to the colonial period. It surges in the old immigration period before the Civil War with Irish and German and other immigrant groups. And it again surges in the late 19th century when these new immigrants begin to arrive.
As it had in years past, much of the anti-immigrant sentiment centered on economics. Some native-born Americans grew angry when immigrants would agree to work for lower wages, seeing this as a threat to their own livelihood. Other native-born saw immigrants as low-class illiterates who brought poverty and crime to America's cities. Some of these beliefs were based on widespread prejudices against immigrants' religious practices.
Not only do you have more Catholics arriving, but you now have Jewish immigrants arriving, so the religious makeup of America is clearly changing.
As they had in decades past, anti-immigrant groups gained power in the late 19th century. With new names and newfound strength, these organizations would eventually gain political traction after the turn of the century.
Just as there were know-nothings in the 1850s, in the 1890s, an organization called the Immigration Restriction League is founded explicitly to pass federal laws to restrict immigration. There's also the American Protective Association, which is based out in the Midwest, principally to oppose Catholic immigration to the United States. There's clearly an organized anti-immigrant movement, and this movement, it'll take a while, but will ultimately be successful. They will, by the 1920s, get the federal government to set up a restrictive quota system that will dramatically decrease the amount of immigrants arriving.
Okay, working conditions. So industry is going to provide jobs, but for very low wages and in poor conditions. So the pull factor here is the jobs, but it's not the wages. Child labor is very common both in factories and in agriculture. There will be during this period some new child labor laws, which talk about 12 years down to 10 years in terms of limiting hours. But agricultural work was exempted from any child labor laws because you're usually working on your family farm. Low-paying jobs also often employed women and children, often in the textile field. In terms of living conditions, you have tenement housing, crowded and windowless housing, very poor sanitation. There would be, public restrooms, which you would have to share, obviously, because I said public. Very few indoor toilets. Many times you'd have to go outside to use the toilet. And so trash and waste would clog alleyways, lots of violence. This is I don't know why I keep putting that up. too soon. This is a little bit of a diagram, a floor map of what a tenement hallway would have looked like, what a typical tenement house would have been. There's a muckraking journalist named Jacob Riis, who we'll talk about soon, but he writes something called How the Other Half Lives, where he publishes photographs of people living in tenement houses. Now, he takes their picture without asking them permission, so there's some ethical questions there, but it really opens a lot of America's eyes to what these conditions are like in these tenement buildings. These are just large apartment buildings. As opposed to, this is the Vanderbilt home. Now, I mean, people are living in what we might even call two different Americas. In the suburbs, you tended to be wealthy. You got to the city because you could pay for transportation. Boston has the first subway. San Francisco, New York City, and Chicago, they will have cable cars. New York City will also have the Brooklyn Bridge and an elevated railway. Chicago will be home to the first skyscrapers made possible by elevators. Steel, which is used for all of these things, changes cities. It also protects from fire by replacing wood structures with steel structures you can build up. Well, if conditions are so bad, then why are cities so attractive? Job opportunities will continue to attract immigrants and rural Americans. There are job opportunities for women. These are the 10 largest cities as of 1900. In the cities, we have the rise also of political machines. Government didn't do much for people in their daily life. They're not going to set protections for wages. They're not going to, help people find and maintain jobs. So what do? Well, they provide for safety and security of the nation, and political machines in larger cities did the rest. These are organizations that control a good deal of urban life. They step in to fill the void of physical and economic safety nets for many residents, including large immigrant populations who didn't know anything else in terms of an American experience. Their goal is to win votes by any means necessary. Those means often included bribery, violence, and patronage. They were run by men named party bosses. The most famous political machine was called Tammany Hall in New York City, and the most famous party boss was a man named Boss Tweed. This is a really well-known cartoon. It depicts Boss Tweed, and he's leaning on the ballot box there. The ballot is next to him, and underneath that it says, "In counting, there is strength." And below, which is hard to make out, it says this, "What's the matter?" That's the title of the cartoon. And Boss Tweed is saying, "As long as I count the votes, what are you going to do about it? Say I." So they worked for different political parties in exchange for voting one way. They would promise jobs, they would promise food, they would promise economic security. Education. Well, this growing demand for more specialized job skills is also going to fuel access to public education. And by 1900, 31 states have compulsory or mandatory education laws for both primary and secondary school. Education, though, is more available in urban areas as opposed to rural areas. Many African Americans and Native Americans are denied access, in particular in the South, and women are often denied access to higher education. So the higher up in grade level you go, the less likely it was that you would run into a woman in school. We also see the rise of private universities, MIT, Johns Hopkins, Rockefeller, and public universities like the Morrill Land Grant Act of 1862, which provides funding for the founding of universities that are aimed at developing agricultural advancement techniques. These are places that will become state universities. And I think you can maybe see which of these are land grant funded universities. So the Ohio State, for example, the University of Tennessee, all the red dots are the ones founded in 1862, the white stars 1890, and there are even some funded in 1994. So a lot of what we consider to be state schools are founded for the purpose of advancing agriculture. We also see advances in medicine and medical care as well as scientific understanding. A debate over how you feel. Are you feeling the disease itself, or are you feeling a symptom of the disease itself? Advancements in testing like x-rays, for example, will allow for an earlier diagnosis, which would ultimately mean better treatment. Medicines like aspirin and the use of blood transfusions will also improve outcomes. And just in general, better hygiene, like sterilizing medical equipment and wearing gloves, are all important, right? Important to stop the spread of disease.